Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to today's webinar. We're happy to have you joining us this morning. Next slide, please. Again, we want to extend our warm welcome to today's webinar, Post-Pandemic Impacts on School-Age Youth Mental Health. This webinar is sponsored by the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC, and we're housed at Rutgers in the School of Health Professions in the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. My name is Kati, and I am the project coordinator of the center and will be introducing our center as well as our webinar presenters for today. The MHTTC is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health workforce to deliver evidence-based and promising practices to individuals with serious mental health conditions. We also address the full continuum of services spanning mental illness prevention, treatment, and recovery supports. We offer training programs in evidence-based practices for serious mental health conditions, wellness and recovery, school mental health, Hispanic and Latinx mental health education, as well as online education courses. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And as a reminder, that all of our training events, technical assistance, and resources are available to you at no cost. Next slide, please. If you're interested in staying up to date with the events and products that our center is offering, we invite you to please sign up to receive our email communications. You may do so by scanning the QR code provided in the screen, and I will also share the link in the chat box before the conclusion of this webinar. Following this webinar, you'll be asked to complete a brief survey. We value this feedback and use it to improve our activities and inform our future training events. The surveys are also important because our continued funding is linked to them. So we thank you in advance for your feedback. We also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website within 7 days of the webinar broadcast. At the time of this presentation, Miriam Delphin-Rittman served as Acting Assistant Secretary for Mental Health and Substance Use at SAMHSA. The opinions expressed herein are the views of the speakers and the presenters and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement of DHHS or SAMHSA for the opinions described in this presentation is intended or should be inferred. We encourage you to interact with our presenter during this webinar feature by using the chat feature. Please post any comments or questions you have in the chat, and your questions will be collected as we go. And also during the end of the webinar, we will also answer questions during the Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. During our webinar, our presenter may pose questions to you, so we ask that you please use the chat feature to answer them. The MHTTC network is committed to using affirming and respectful recovery-oriented language in all of our activities. We also want to let you know that of the new 3-digit dialing code for the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline through 988. 988 is not just a suicide crisis line, it's for people experiencing a suicidal, mental health, or substance use crisis of any kind or emotional distress. It's also for people who are concerned about someone experiencing a crisis. You can connect by calling or texting 988, or you can chat online at 988lifeline.org. Calls, texts, or chats are responded by a trained crisis counselor. Now let's begin our webinar. We have Dr. Susie Millar and Sonia Rodriguez-Marto with us today. Sonia Rodriguez-Marto is a licensed professional counselor, a licensed marriage and family therapist, a licensed drug and alcohol counselor, and a national certified counselor and an approved clinical supervisor. She is the Senior Director of School and Community-Based Programs at Rutgers University Behavioral Healthcare, which provides professional development and intensive mental health programs to youth and families in public, private, and out-of-district school settings. She has been working with school-based mental health for the past 20 years. She has her own private practice where she works with adolescents and adults and is an advocate for children and families living in impoverished communities, immigrants, the Latinx community, and women and children who have experienced trauma. She has written several grants focused on expanding school-based mental health services in schools. She serves on several boards for schools and nonprofit agencies focused on supporting youth and families. She has presented on a variety of workshops on topics related to stress and anxiety among teens, integrating mindfulness practices in schools, completing suicide risk assessments, non-suicidal self-injury, supporting youth in schools and the community in a post-COVID world, clinical implications for working with Latinx youth and families, supporting immigrant youth in schools, and on treating survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. Dr. Susie Millar is a New Jersey licensed clinical psychologist, and over the past 10 years, Dr. Millar has served as a therapist, clinical supervisor, program manager, and program director of school and community-based programs at Rutgers University Behavioral Healthcare. As a program director at Rutgers UBHC, Dr. Millar manages several school-based programs throughout the state of New Jersey and plays a lead role in supervising trainees in the APA-accredited doctoral internship program at Rutgers. Dr. Millar also provides a variety of trainings for school district faculty and parents throughout New Jersey on several topics, including trauma, anxiety, working with intense children, mindfulness, and social emotional learning. She has also presented at several international, state, and national conferences, including the annual American Psychological Association conference. Dr. Millar also works in private practice, working primarily with clients struggling with depression, anxiety, and trauma. So at this time, I will turn it over to our presenters. And again, welcome.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this morning. So today we're going to cover 4 objectives. We're going to provide you with an overview of the prevalence of mental health challenges among youth before and after the COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to examine some of the specific groups of youth that may be more vulnerable to mental health challenges post-pandemic. We're going to explore some pandemic-related changes in behavior patterns and coping mechanisms that youth have adopted, including the role of technology. And lastly, we're going to end with ways in which schools can identify students who experience persistent challenges and implement school-based programs to best support these youth. So we're going to start with this question. If you could give your students or clients one thing, what would it be? So you can go ahead and scan the QR code, or you can also join at slido.com and put in the code that you see there. So what is one thing that you wish you could give to your students or clients? Resilience. Confidence. Self-confidence, absolutely. More autonomy, optimism, hope. Secure attachment, I like that one. Self-care, stability, comfort. The knowledge I now have, interesting, I like that. Support, safety. And if you've ever seen a word cloud, the bigger the word gets, the more people are putting in that same word. So we can see resilience is getting quite large. Hope, safety, peace. So we're seeing some patterns here, right? So we're seeing that what we're really hoping to give our youth is the ability to feel like they can manage challenges that come their way. And with everything that our youth have been through over the past several years, it's understandable that they would be struggling a lot more. So all of these words really show that we're all in that same place of really hoping to give them that ability to manage challenges that come their way and to do it effectively. So feel free to continue to respond to the question, and we're going to move on to the next slide. So how does the prevalence of mental health issues differ among youth before and after the COVID pandemic, right? That's a question that we get asked quite frequently. And when I started in school-based back in 2012, Rutgers UBHC was in about 3 school-based programs throughout the state, and now we are in over 44 districts. So that really shows that schools are recognizing the need of incorporating mental health supports for their youth within their buildings. And really specifically within the past 4 or 5 years, we've really seen such an influx in the challenges that our youth are experiencing post-pandemic and really kind of looking at ways to support them. So I really like this slide. Same storm, different boats. We all went through the same pandemic, right? Each and every one of us on this call and the youth that we support. But the truth is that we all managed it in very different ways and we all experienced it in very different ways. Many of us were fortunate that we were able to continue to keep our jobs and continue to be able to provide for our families, but that's not the case for all of the youth that we work with and may not necessarily have been the case for all of us on this call today. So keeping that in mind, that even though we all experienced the same traumatic situation, we all experienced it in very different ways, depending on what our life circumstances were. We're going to play this quick video that really kind of talks about the teen mental health crisis post-pandemic.
Well, sticking with schools and a topic we talk about often here on Morning News Now, mental health. And for many students, it can be a major factor in the success they might see at school.
The CDC says the number of kids feeling sad or hopeless has gone up 40% in the last 10 years. Those numbers, of course, were accelerated by the COVID pandemic. Dr. Robbie Ludwig is here with us to talk more. She's a psychotherapist and an award-winning reporter. Good to have you with us. You know, some kids are excited to go back to school, but for some, it is not a good time. Describe some of the challenges those students are facing, and has it gotten worse since the pandemic?
Well, during the pandemic, I think what we saw is that it was harder to educate our kids virtually. It was harder for them to stay
Sorry.
focused, and I think some of the numbers declined over time, and also in terms of social anxiety. So whenever you're away from something, it can build up anxiety when you're returning to an in-person school. There's social anxiety, there's concerns about academic success. For younger kids, it's separation anxiety. So all of these play a role in how a child feels when returning back to school.
And there could be a difficult time for a lot of kids. So how can they shift their mindset? There can be problems at home. Maybe they don't make a team or they get a bad grade. How can they help themselves here?
I think and this is where parents can come in and let their child know that they are there to support them. And really to use these situations and setbacks so you can help them to be resilient, because that's what they will use in life. To view school as a fresh start. If they don't get the grade they want, talk to your teacher and say, what can I do differently? If you don't make a team that you're interested in, again, ask for feedback, try something else. Focus on secure friendships that make you feel good. These are all things parents can remind their child to do to set an intention for the year so that they can make the most of the year ahead.
What are some tips that you have for kids who might be having a hard time with some of these things?
And it's the same thing. I mean, you want to observe, first of all, if your child is having a problem, set a regular goal. So when parents can set a regular schedule, that's highly effective for younger kids in terms of adjusting to the school year. Observe if they're having any emotional regulation, and encourage them to talk to you about their feelings and struggles, and just create that space. Family dinner time is a wonderful place for kids to talk. Sometimes for young teens, if parents stay up a little later, they're less resistant to sharing their emotions.
Put those phones away, parents and kids.
Put the
right?
phones
They're
away.
all
I'm
right.
so addicted to mine. I put it far away.
Dr. Robbie Ludwig, thank you so much. Good to have you
Yeah.
on. And anytime we talk about mental health, we want to make sure you know, or if anyone you know is struggling, you can call or text the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at 988.
So we really wanted to start with that video just to kind of give us an overview. And what we're going to spend the next few minutes doing is really going into some of those more specific the specifics about what our youth have really experienced over the past several years. So now we are several years out from pandemic, but we're still seeing an impact in terms of how our youth have experienced it. So some of the challenges that our children face throughout the pandemic are things like a change in structure and routine, right? So especially in the beginning, there was a lot of fear and worry regarding their own safety, the safety of others, what their future would hold. We found that 29% had a caretaker who had lost their job during that time, during that 2020, 2021 time period. There was a significant loss of life events, whether it be graduation, prom, birthday parties at one point, right? Getting to see family, connect with peers, being able to do sports and all these after school activities. There's a significant shift in terms of what they were able to do. And for some of our kids, they're still reeling with some of that. Loss of loved ones, over 200,000 children lost a caretaker during that time period. And loss of security. Statistics show that about 55% experienced emotional abuse by a caregiver, and 11% experienced physical abuse by a caregiver. And then, of course, that social isolation piece. And we're still finding that a lot of our youth are struggling with that component of readjusting to a healthy socialization, being able to make friends and support and get that support that they need, being able to communicate effectively. And of course, the social and political unrest that continues to be in our country and in our world in general. So what are we seeing in our children? We're seeing a pretty significant increase in terms of depression, anxiety. We're seeing that they're experiencing low self-esteem, difficulty with peer relationships, being able to connect and maintain relationships. We're seeing that there's an increase in anger and behavioral concerns, so that externalizing way of navigating their emotions. And we're seeing a pretty significant increase in terms of eating disorders. In terms of environmental stressors, we're definitely seeing some increase in family stressors, challenges within families for being able to communicate effectively and being able to manage stressors that come their way. Some of our children are still struggling with academic difficulties, depending on when their education was interrupted and how they're navigating transitioning back. Transition issues in a lot of variety of different ways, whether it be transitioning back to school. We're still seeing a pretty significant number of kids with truancy and school avoidance. Abuse, we talked about some of those statistics, and trauma. So one study really found that among US high schoolers in 2021, they're finding that the girls and youth identifying as LGB are experiencing and are more likely to experience sadness and hopelessness over the past year. So you could see that about 37% were identifying that their mental health was not good among overall. And then we could see when comparing boys to girls, the girls were about 49%. And when we compared heterosexual youth compared to LGBT youth, we found that 64% of them identified as that were not feeling well. At some point over the past 12 months, they were asked if they were feeling sad or hopeless, and we found that girls said about 57%, and our LGBT youth are about 76%. So we can see that these numbers are staggering, and this was 2021. So we know that that's continued to, our youth are continuing to struggle. So according to the CDC, they found that 1 in 3 high school students reported poor mental health, and about 50% of students reported feeling persistently sad or hopeless. And again, you can see those statistics comparing sex and LGBT identity versus heterosexual identity. So we could see that 30.6% identified anxiety within our females and 43% of LGBT youth, compared to 25% identified depression of our females and 37% of our LGBT youth. So these are definitely concerning statistics that we're seeing, and something that we really want to be mindful of. How do we support these youth who are feeling this way? We're also seeing a significant increase in terms of suicide rates. So post-pandemic, we saw a decrease. And I think, kids being at home, it removed a lot of stressors at the time, but also created different types of stressors, right? So we saw a significant decrease initially, but you can see that it's significantly going up over the past several years. So about 12% of females are reporting a suicide attempt within the past year, and 25% of our LGB youth. We're also seeing a pretty significant increase in terms of gun-related suicides and homicide deaths in youth. So this shows you some of those statistics on suicide death rates over the past several years. So we can see that there's a significant increase in terms of our Black youth. It went from about 2.5% in 2012 to the percentage change was about 5.6% in 2022. Overall, it went from 4.5% to 6%. So these are statistics that we definitely want to be mindful of in terms of how we're supporting them and how we're tracking what we're seeing within our youth. So we mentioned that anxiety and depression are significantly increasing, and we know that anxiety disorders as a group are the most common mental illness that occurs within children and adolescents. There's a lifetime prevalence of about 15 to 20%. And looking at statistics from 2012 to 2022, the anxiety rate in youth went from about 11.6% to 20.5%. Children with anxiety are also 3 times more likely to develop depression. And the reason for that, if you think about anxiety disorders as a group, it's really that sense of hopelessness. No matter what I do, I can't control the worry, I can't control the fears. And when kids live with that for a significant period of time, it can lead to depression because they start to feel hopeless. When we look at depression trends within our youth, we can see that from 2018 to 2022, there was a significant increase in terms of the rate. It went from 3.2% to 15.08%. And we also know that having another disorder is most common in children with depression. So that comorbidity with anxiety, as we mentioned, there's about 73.8% who also have anxiety, and 47.2% also have a behavioral concern. And sometimes we're seeing those behavioral concerns as a way of these kids who are experiencing these intense or internalizing feelings. It becomes more externalized because they just don't know how to ask for the help. And according to the Child Mind Institute's Child Mental Health Report, we found that about 80% of children with anxiety and 60% of children with depression are not getting treatment. And we know that left untreated, children with anxiety and depression tend to be at higher risk for a variety of different things, including behavioral issues. They tend to perform more poorly in school. They miss out on important social experiences and engage in substance use. And we'll talk more specifically about some of those symptoms in a little bit. I mentioned earlier that we're also seeing an increase in terms of eating disorder trends within youth. So from 2018 to 2022, we saw a 100.7% increase in children under the age of 17 visiting a healthcare provider because of an eating disorder. The current statistic is that about 22% of children have unhealthy eating behavior, which could lead to an eating disorder. And 12% of adolescent females have been diagnosed with an eating disorder. So it's definitely a concern that we're seeing such an increase in it. And there is a variety of eating disorder type treatments, but we are still seeing that there's not enough for what our youth need, especially for our families that aren't insured or only have Medicaid. We're finding that it's a little bit more challenging for them to find resources. In terms of substance use, we had mentioned that we're also seeing an increase in substance use and substance use related deaths among youth. So this shows you some of those statistics. So nearly 4 out of 5 adolescents were involved in a drug overdose death in 2022. So we can see some of those statistics there in terms of that increase. And drug overdose death rates have increased faster among our Black and Hispanic adolescents than in some of our other adolescents, but we're seeing pretty staggering increases in terms of those numbers. And again, as we mentioned earlier, if our kids are struggling with more of these internalizing feelings, we're seeing more of those externalizing responses. So the substance use increases a lot of times tend to be related to them trying to manage those feelings that they don't know how to support themselves with. We're also seeing an increase in violence. So in 2021, the CDC found that 20% of females and 22% of LGBTQ plus youth experience sexual violence. And 15% of females and 20% of LGBTQ plus youth were forced to have sex. And these are based on youth reports. They also found that 23% of LGBT youth were identifying as being bullied in school. And 7% of youth overall were feeling threatened or injured with a weapon at school. 9% were reporting truancy due to feeling unsafe. And we also found that significant numbers of youth were experiencing bullying electronically. Sorry, my computer's trying to shut down, so I'm just making sure it doesn't do that again. So some of the contributing factors, we mentioned that they're experiencing increases in social isolation. And despite the fact that it's several years out, some of our kids still don't feel like they really have those strategies and those skills for how to maintain and develop relationships. That's something they're continuing to struggle with. We're still reeling from those academic challenges. I can speak from personal experience. My son was in kindergarten when the pandemic first started. So his kindergarten year was interrupted, and that was such a critical year for learning to read and developing a lot of those skills. And he's in 4th grade now, and he's still continuing to feel like he's catching up on that. So despite the fact that several years have passed, our kids who really struggled during that time, they're still reeling from it. Economic uncertainties, there's still a lot of families that are struggling with making sure that they can support their family and provide for them. And we're seeing an increase in terms of the cost of living. So if our families are financially struggling, it's becoming even more challenging for them to support their families. Witnessing violence, arguing in the home. We mentioned some of those statistics about what they're seeing at home. And then we talked about those loss of experiences. And for some of our kids, they're still grieving the fact that they had some of these experiences that they didn't get to have. So anxiety in our children. So some of the things that you should be looking for, a lot of our kids experience anxiety in terms of physical symptoms. So these are kids that might be spending a lot of time going down to the nurse, complaining of headaches, stomach aches, just not feeling well. When our body doesn't know how to manage these intense feelings that we have, it tends to turn into physical ways of navigating it because they don't know how to put the words into it. Difficulty falling or staying asleep. So challenges with sleep patterns, avoidance. So kids who all of a sudden don't really want to be socializing, spending a lot of time in their rooms, putting their heads down, not really raising their hand and participating in class. And then we mentioned that piece about that a lot of times we're seeing that those emotional symptoms, that internalizing feelings, turn into externalizing as a way of them trying to really express how they're feeling. It becomes so overwhelming for them not understanding what's happening inside their bodies that we sometimes see irritability, defiance, anger, frustration, more tantruming behaviors. At school, we might see a lack of focus or over planning. So those kids who need to know everything that's coming up next, they must know their schedule, must know their routine. They struggle with any changes in routine. And then negative thinking, really kind of being very critical of themselves. Within our adolescence, we're finding unfounded or unrealistic fears as well. Feeling nervous or on edge. They're quick to snap. Their emotions kind of shift very frequently. Apathy or decreased interest. And then those unexplained outbursts that really don't feel like they're in line with or connected to what their experience has been. And with anxiety, when we're really kind of looking at some of those behaviors on the surface, right? That avoidance, the over planning, the anger, the sleep issues. A lot of times it's really them trying to navigate those feelings underneath that they can't understand, feeling depressed, overwhelmed, grieving, feeling disrespected or embarrassed, having shame, feeling rejected. There's so many different components of what anxiety can look like and the emotional response to it. And especially with our youth, when we're quick to say, why are you feeling that way? You're doing great in school, you're doing well, you have such a great life. It really undermines or minimizes some of those feelings that they're experiencing, and it makes them feel like they're not really heard. So depression in our children can also look like irritability or anger. When you're feeling hopeless, when you're feeling overwhelmed, when you can't really understand these big feelings, these big emotions, we're seeing that it can shift to these very externalized symptoms as a way of them trying to really express what's going on. So it's also this continuous feeling of sadness and hopelessness that they feel like they can't control, that it doesn't go away. It might look like changes in appetite or sleep, difficulty concentrating, increased sensitivity to rejection. So if they raise their hand and they're not called upon, all of a sudden this becomes a direct rejection of them, and they start to feel very overwhelmed by that. Or if, they have a social interaction where they're not invited, or they, somebody ignores them, that they're going to feel that very deeply. It might look like feelings of worthlessness or guilt, feeling that everything's their fault, that they have no control over things that are happening in their lives. It might look like physical complaints. Again, those are our kids that are spending a lot of time going down to the nurse, not feeling well. It might look like fatigue or low energy, despite how much sleep they get. They're oversleeping or undersleeping. They're getting interrupted sleep. And it might also look like loss of interest in pleasurable activities. So they're not attending to things that they used to enjoy. They're pulling out of sports or clubs. They're saying no to their peers or spending a lot of time in their room. And then when we look at adolescents, we're adding in things like irresponsible behavior. So they're forgetting their obligations, refusing to do homework or chores at home. They're not coming to work. They're giving up on activities that they used to enjoy, rebelliousness or risk-seeking behaviors. You might see that they're talking about driving recklessly or engaging in unsafe substance use or sexual behaviors. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Sonia to talk about some of those vulnerable groups.
So we really want to be mindful of groups that are particularly vulnerable at this time. So we want to look at youth who had pre-existing conditions pre-pandemic. We certainly want to take a look at marginalized communities, immigrant populations, youth that have recently transferred into a school, and youth who have experienced loss during the pandemic and post-pandemic. So we really want to be mindful of these groups and make sure that they have the support that they need. I'm going to talk a little bit about the behavioral changes that we're seeing in youth at this time. Certainly seeing an increased screen time. So lots of kids super reliant on their phones, getting phones much earlier on. At a younger age, altered sleep patterns, staying up pretty late to either play video games or talk on the phone or FaceTime with their friends. We're seeing changes in substance use, certainly access, the concept of vaping, where we don't even smell it or see it at times. We think it's easily accessible. Withdrawal from peers and social supports is always something we want to be concerned about. So I want to pose a question. If you could enter in the chat, how do these factors impact youth mental health? So how do you think these factors, these changes we're seeing, how do you think they're impacting youth today? You just type in the chat. Okay, isolation, yeah. Increased depression, hopelessness, lack of interpersonal skills. Yes, overly reliant on connecting with people on the internet, poor social skills, poor sleep habits, decreased ability to function in everyday life, right? We're seeing low academic performance, worsening mental health issues, false sense of reality, refusal to go to school. Absolutely, all of these things. Low patience, used to instant gratification. Yes, not used to waiting for things, right? They have everything accessible on their phones. Great, thank you for sharing that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the ways in which they're coping. So what are the coping mechanisms that youth have adopted during the pandemic, right? I think a lot of them have turned to the internet and connecting with people online. So a lot of youth we hear is talk about having friends online, but not necessarily friends in person. We've also learned that they can easily access resources and mental health supports online through the use of chats. Now there's online therapy, so they can just chat with the therapist. We have a number of hotlines that they can call. So youth are certainly utilizing a lot of things related to technology. And so what role has technology played in either exacerbating symptoms or alleviating symptoms, right? So technology has helped kids stay connected with friends, their classroom and the world during the pandemic. And now they've also had the ability to stay connected with people online in ways that we haven't been, right? So the use of Zoom, FaceTime, to be able to connect with people all over the country. And so that has been very, very helpful. And as I mentioned previously, certainly the opportunity to connect online with resources and therapy. Some of the downsides are that it has led to too many hours of screen time, right? So lack of socialization, lack of social skills, and very, very often comparing themselves to others and creating unrealistic messages about what they're supposed to look like. I think the other issue that comes up a lot is when they know that there's a party going on or friends are hanging out and they weren't invited, that it very easily lends itself to feelings of not being included and them being very upset about that. So coping mechanisms that they can use, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the different coping mechanisms, is certainly therapy or group support. There's so many great resources out there for them to join online support groups. We're really, in our work, we're really encouraging the participation of groups and trying to provide lots of additional groups, both during school hours, during lunches, and after school, for students to be able to connect and learn that they're not alone in a lot of the feelings that they're having. I'm certainly encouraging them to connect with friends and family, spending more time connecting and participating in activities. Journaling, mindfulness, exercise is always important, and deep breathing. So we have a couple of resources that we're going to share here. We have a ton of mindfulness activity resources. We encourage mindfulness on a regular basis. So I just wanted to share out some of these activities and resources that you can use with students or even your own children or any of the youth that you work with in your private practice or community-based settings. GoNoodle.com is a wonderful resource to get young kids moving and interacting in the classroom setting. The 4-7-8 breathing and belly breathing techniques are also very, very helpful. Going on a mindful walk with kids. This can be done during the day. If you have an opportunity to take kids out of the classroom setting, noticing colors, paying attention to their senses. We've got a link here for some mindfulness activities for teachers. And we certainly have also done work around visual imagery and progressive muscle relaxation. One of our favorites is also the Take 5 grounding exercise. And you can just encourage kids to pay attention to 5 things that they can see, 4 things that they can feel, 3 things they can hear, 2 things they can smell, and 1 thing that they can taste. So we really like this activity, and it works with all ages. We've also used the color zones of regulation. So curious if you could enter in the chat how many of you are familiar with this, how many of you are using this, and what your thoughts are on the color zones of regulation. But we like to utilize visuals with our kids, particularly our young kids. The thermometer is a good visual for them so that they can help us identify how they're feeling. So we have, talked about body signals, what are some warning signs, and then we talk about what ways that they can use to cope with some of these feelings that they're having. We've also used the scale of emotional intensity. So we encourage kids to check in with themselves, to look at where they might feel on that scale of emotional intensity. So certainly the red zone means that they have high emotional intensity and that we encourage them to utilize some of the distress tolerance skills. And then if they're in the blue zone, we encourage them to use some of their emotional regulation skills. We also really like the Distract with ACEs approach. The A in ACEs is for activities, so encouraging them to use activities that require thought and concentration. C is for contributing, focus on someone or something other than yourself. E is for emotions, do something that will create a competing emotion. And the fourth one is sensations, finding safe physical sensations to distract them from intense negative emotions. And so we talk a lot too about making sure that they build their support system. And for a lot of kids who have really complex family or home environments, or in a lot of the youth that I work with, they are often here alone or just with an aunt or uncle. They come from their home country and their parents were either left behind or they've been separated from their families. So we really encourage them to connect with anyone around them, particularly a teacher, a coach, friends, and family friends. So we think that it's very, very important for kids to establish a support system. So what other things can we do? We can really help youth try to create a sense of structure or routine. This can be very helpful for a lot of youth. Taking cues from a child. So, what do they need and when do they need it? Sometimes they need space. Sometimes they need hugs. Sometimes they just need to talk about things and they need us to listen. So really just trying to identify what a child needs in any particular moment and recognizing that they're going to need different things based on how they're feeling. So allowing them to ask questions and respond honestly and age appropriately. But I also think it's so important to create an environment that feels safe and that we do a lot more listening sometimes rather than speaking. Sometimes they just want to feel heard. Validating and acknowledging that their feelings are valid and normal. Noticing their changes in mood or behaviors, helping them create a toolbox of their own helpful skills. So this is really important. We do this a lot in our work. We really encourage kids to come up oftentimes with a physical toolbox or basket of things that they can utilize when they're feeling dysregulated, and recognizing that when they have different emotions, they're going to need different items or different tools out of their toolbox. So really important for kids to identify what works for them. Some kids really like to write about things and journal. Some kids find that to not be helpful and they have more physical energy and they need to take walks or go shoot a basketball. So really recognizing that each child needs something different. And then being mindful of our own feelings and reactions and what's going on for us and how we might be impacting them. So we do a lot of work in schools, and we feel that schools are really the ideal place to provide mental health supports because students can receive a full continuum of services. So we can really connect with the teachers, the nurse, the school counselors, the child study team case manager, the family, and really just all work together to provide support for the student or child. Programming often emphasizes a shared responsibility to fill in any gaps and to ensure students don't fall through the cracks. So really encouraging staff working in schools to talk a lot about who's working with what youth and making sure that we're not spending too much time on one child and neglecting other kids who might not be presenting with symptoms that we haven't been paying attention to, but making sure that we have a point person for most of the kids that we're working with. Having a strong connection between the school and the community is very important. We do a lot of partnerships with the YMCAs, the community family support organizations, really feeling like we can connect with the community and also providing programs in the community, not just in the school setting. And really moving towards a collaborative service model. to ensure that we have wraparound services, not just to support the whole child, but their family as well. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the strategies that we think are helpful for implementing supportive school-based mental health programs. We really feel like it's helpful to integrate a tiered system of support so that we can identify which level of support each youth or student needs, and recognizing that for some kids, we're going to need to do prevention work and going into classrooms and providing psychoeducational workshops at a tier 1 level. Tier 2 level might mean that we need a little bit of individual support and we need to check in with this youth on a weekly basis, or a tier 3 level of support where we need to really ensure that this youth has lots of different supports in the building, including individual and group support, as well as family support. We should really take consideration to utilizing a school-wide screening so we make sure we don't miss kids or have kids fall through the cracks. This identification process helps address mental health needs of all youth and ensuring that we can connect those youth to resources. Establishing school-based health centers or community partnerships with health and mental health providers can be very helpful. So really not just looking at the emotional well-being of a child, but also their physical well-being, and how could we partner with community agencies to make sure that we are providing supports in all areas. And creating a healthy, safe, and supportive school climate. So really looking at providing a trauma-informed school, incorporating social and emotional learning into core curriculums, and really training teachers on this approach. And we've done a lot of work around utilizing the 5 core strategies. So some of the additional strategies for addressing the mental health and well-being needs of youth include incorporating SEL into all of their classroom settings, promoting parental engagement, supporting families and caregivers, rebuilding relationships with peers and teachers, thinking about creative ways to increase school connectedness. How can we get a child to feel connected in their building, or there's certain clubs that they might feel connected to, even if they're struggling in their academic classes, or is there a sport they might be interested in? Balancing academic learning opportunities with social, emotional, and behavioral support, and then providing resources for mental health. So what can we provide that helps to reduce their stress and manage their anxiety? And then what kinds of programming and skills could we teach them to help build and foster resilience? We also want to make sure that we're taking care of educators and staff. We spend a lot of time focusing on youth and what they need, but we also want to ensure that we are supporting the staff and identifying what their needs are. So we've done this a lot with needs assessments and Google surveys to kind of figure out what staff needs. We've had some of our clinicians do support groups for some of the teachers, especially post-pandemic, to help them, to provide them with resources, as well as help them identify some of the youth that might need more support, and then to also talk about their own self-care strategies. So we want to also think about what learning opportunities we can provide them, and then find a way to provide direct support. We've partnered with a lot of employee assistance programs, and some of our staff have also been tasked with providing additional support to staff in the after-school hours. So we've been able to work closely with staff and then to eventually connect them with their own mental health providers. Some of the resources that I wanted to share with you that might help for building some of these school partnerships. I really like this how-to model on building a school community partnership. That's listed here, Partnering for Student Success. A framework for building a successful community school is listed here as well. And then we've got an action guide for building effective integrated student support system, and then some tools for starting and building community schools. And so those 4 resources are very, very helpful when thinking about how to come up with a way to build a partnership. And then just lastly, we have some apps because we know that youth tend to gravitate toward utilizing something that they can access on their phone. So we want to highlight the Dailyo Journal, the Second Floor Youth Helpline, which we have a lot of our students access, My Life Meditation app, the Virtual Hope Box, which is one of my favorites, and then certainly the Headspace app, which helps with meditation and sleep that many of you may be aware of. And here are some of our references, and then we're going to take it to the Q&A. So certainly feel free to type in some questions in the chat box.
Yes, thank you so much, Sonia and Susie, for all of that very helpful information and also the incredibly helpful strategies that you shared. Really appreciate that. We actually have 2 questions that are already in the Q&A, and we welcome others to share some questions. Other questions, if they're not answered here, we can also help to answer them later. So one of them is around the increasing need, and I'm going to paraphrase this a bit, in terms of mental health and social emotional skills that are really lagging behind, and whether and the tendency to go to tier 3 level supports. And then in terms of based on the volume and nature of this need, do you see the benefit of for mental health care, shifting to more of a group-based or tier 2 level supports to manage the high level of need?
Great question. I think that we're always going to need both tiers because I think that you're going to always have youth who feel more comfortable talking about their issues and their concerns in an individualized setting where they just don't feel comfortable sharing some of the things that they might be struggling with. You know, I always encourage my clients and the youth that we work with to connect with group supports. But I do find that particularly when there are, some very sensitive issues that they have experienced, that they're not quite comfortable sharing that in a group setting. At the same time, I do feel like a group can be very helpful for youth because it helps them not feel so isolated. It helps them feel like there are other people their age who have similar issues, and then to learn about what everyone is doing or utilizing in terms of coping to help them through this difficult time. Do you want to add anything, Susie?
No, I think that's great. And I think too, as Sonia mentioned, there are kids who do definitely benefit from that group level. And I think sometimes what we're trying to do is also partner the group with the individual, because there's certain strategies and skills that we can teach in a group and format, but then for individual kids who have a lot going on, having that individual space to then be able to process and specifically learn about how to use the skills in their personal life can be really valuable. And it looks like the second question here, how can elders be of help to youth? I think this is a great question. So our kids are really craving adults in their life who are able to be present and hear them out. And having that listening ear, as Sonia mentioned, sometimes stepping away from the teaching and telling them what they need to do, and more so just hearing them out and validating their experience. So having that person that's willing to just sit with them and be able to hear out what their concerns are, how they're experiencing things. I think a lot of times as adults, we're quick to jump to solutions. Oh, you're having this problem, you're having this struggle, this is what you can do. And when we're coming up with the solutions for them, some of our youth are going to push back and say, no, that's not going to work. I've already tried everything. Because what they're really craving is somebody to just validate what they're experiencing, what they're going through. We love to use problem-solving frameworks too, because then you're letting them express their feelings, validate what they're going through, and then you're partnering it with, let's work together to see how to help you develop a solution. And then we're teaching that sense of resiliency, helping them feel successful, and we're also then building up self-esteem.
Thank you so much. I hate to interrupt, but I know that we have only a few minutes left and we have to finish up the sort of evaluation portion. I just want to give you one last word here. We have several questions that weren't answered, and I apologize for running out of time here. And we'll try to answer your questions in another through email if possible. Okay, thank you so much, Sonia and Susie. I'm
Great.
going to turn over, excuse me, go ahead.
I just said thank you.
I'm going to turn things over to Kati now, who's going to complete our evaluation. And we thank you very much. Please take some time for the rest of the slides and evaluation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you, Dr. Millar and Sonia, for providing us with a wonderful presentation this morning. As Alicia mentioned, we invite you to take a moment to complete our short evaluation survey. I shared the link in the chat box, and you can also access the evaluation through scanning the QR code that you see on your screen. Next slide, please. We also invite you to subscribe to our podcast channel, Toward Wellness and Recovery, and you can find it on Spotify, Apple Music, or Podbean. We currently are featuring Flourishing at Work, a plan for helping professionals, and we think we may enjoy it and find it useful. Next slide, please. So if you joined us late today, or you had to leave today, or you'd like to watch this webinar again, this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on our website within 7 days of this broadcast, and everyone will also receive a certificate of completion, as well as a link to the evaluation and a link to download the presenter slides. Next slide, please. Next slide. And again, if you'd like to connect with us or have any questions, you may email us at northeastcaribbean@mhttcnetwork.org or follow us on our several social media outlets. We have Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and our handles are located on the screen at this moment. Next slide. And again, we just want to thank you all for participating. We hope that you will join us again for any future training events and activities. Thank you again to our presenters. Alicia, thank you for your support during this webinar. And again, we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.